All right, let's go to Romans chapter 12 here. It says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." This has to be one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. In chapter 11, Paul tells the Gentiles will be brought, it says that the Gentiles will be brought into God's kingdom. That is, all people who aren't Jewish by birth. And then he says all Israel will be saved. And how can that happen? It is only by God's mercy and grace. "Therefore, in view of God's mercy and grace, offer your body as a living sacrifice." This verse so often applies to individuals. You know, we say offer your body. It's about you. And to some extent that's true. But the greater context of Romans chapter 12 is not about each individual and what you can do for yourself, but it's about what you as an individual can do for the church. It has to do with the church as a body, just as the worship team sang for us. So today we conclude our series called Leave It Better Than You Found It. And we're going to look at how we can leave the church better than we found it when we showed up today. So we began this series a couple weeks ago looking at ourselves. How can you leave yourself better than you found it? We looked at our physical health and our mental health, and we also understood that life is on earth is temporary, but life after earth is eternal. So how can we choose to leave ourselves better? Then last week we looked at how we can have better relationships. How can you leave relationships better than you found it? How can you serve people? Follow the golden rule. Be genuine. Share the good news. How far will you go to leave a relationship better than when you found it? But today it's about the church. Jesus died and rose again for the church. In Ephesians chapter 5, it says Jesus gave himself up for the church. Now that's a pretty big sacrifice if you ask me. In fact, that's everything. So I'm going to ask you today, what do you need to sacrifice for the church? What do you need to give up? How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? The Statler brothers sang the song years ago, "I'll go to my grave loving you." And that meant no matter what happened, until I die, my love for you will not fade away. Will you go to the grave loving the church? Will you go to the grave loving the church? Will you love the church till death do you part? That is my hope and my prayer for you. If Jesus believed the church is worth dying for, then for us it better be worth living for and sacrificially. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? Came across a story this week, and I tried to look up to see if it was a parable or if it was true, and I couldn't find out. I just couldn't find any sources on it. But it's about a young Christian nurse who began working with a leper colony in India. See, she would work at a hospital during the day, and then she would volunteer at the leper colony at night. And she would work long hours. And a reporter got word of what she was doing, so they followed her around one day after she got off work at the hospital, and she would go into this man who had leprosy, and he had open sores and wounds, and she would change the bandages on him, and she would bathe him, and then she would put new clothes on him, and it was a very physically demanding, and if you're going to be in the most obvious terms, it was pretty gross to some extent. And the reporter watched all that took place and said, I watched all that you do, and I wouldn't do it for $1 million. And the young nurse said, I wouldn't do it for $1 million either. But for Jesus, I'd do it for free. What will you do for Jesus? What will you do for his church? How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? 12:3. For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. How far you're willing to go for the church that Jesus died for begins with this: an honest assessment. To serve the church as God has called us to, we need to know about ourselves. We need to look at ourselves, Paul says, with sober judgment. So there's two principles we need to discuss. The first is, this is not a self-condemning phrase. Some people only see their flaws. They beat themselves up. They always say things like, I'm so stupid. I'm not smart enough. I'm too weak. I don't know enough. And Paul is not encouraging you to be self-condemning. He says, think of yourself with sober judgment. Know your limits. A couple weeks ago, Dan Keene and I were talking about singing on the worship team, and I said, I don't sing on the worship team because I don't sing well. And Dan said, well, some people say that in a humility way. They do sing well, but they just don't want to act like they're being prideful. I said, oh, I know what you're talking about, but there's no false humility here. I don't sing well. If I'm singing on the worship team, it's a bad Sunday. And it's just not my area of giftedness. But I don't let that limit me from serving the church in other ways. Just because I don't sing well doesn't mean I can't serve well in another area. And so this phrase should not cause you to beat yourself up about what you can't do. The second thing that this principle should teach us, sober judgment, is that don't overvalue your ability or importance. Now, you're important because Jesus died on the cross for your sins. How much more important could you possibly be? He's forgiven you. But remember, Jesus also said if you refuse to worship him, the rocks and the trees would cry out to him. No church should be built on one person apart from Jesus Christ himself. So don't be so arrogant or proud that your head is so swelled that you have to use the double door entrance to get into the building, all right? Use your skills to serve God in a humble way. Besides, whatever skills you have, it's a gift from God anyway. You might have exercised those skills, you might have practiced hard, but your ability, your giftedness, is a gift from God. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? Bryce Harper made some big headlines this past offseason by signing the largest contract in baseball history for about 2 weeks anyway, until Mike Trout got paid. And he made $330 million over the course of the next 13 years. Now, last year it was rumored that Bryce Harper might become the first $400 million athlete in sports history. That is, he would sign a contract worth more than $400 million to take a piece of wood and hit a piece of leather over a padded wall. That's what he was going to get paid to do. Incredible. And they were interviewing him about it and said, what do you think about possibly being the first $400 million athlete? And do you know what he told the reporter? Don't sell me short. Don't sell me short. There's not been hardly a $300 million athlete, much less a $400. You think $400 million is selling you short? What an arrogant cuss, as my dad would say. And he wouldn't cuss. He would call him an arrogant cuss. But I tell you, my goodness, wouldn't it have been a much better response if he said, wow, a team would think that much of me, that they would pay me that kind of money to be involved in their community, to volunteer at their children's hospital, to go out there and encourage the youth of America to play baseball, and then to play and entertain the fans. Wow, what an honor it would be if a team would offer me that kind of contract. What kind of attitude that would display would be completely different. The church has no place for don't sell me short attitudes. Think of yourself with sober judgment. You don't need to beat yourself up. Don't overinflate your importance. Just humbly serve. All right, let's continue reading. For just as each of you has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. So after we have a humble assessment of ourselves, we need to move from I want to I will. We need to move from I want to I will. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? I imagine there are churches all over this world that have talent they could not dream about. But they don't know they have that talent because someone is unwilling to serve. Someone's too wrapped a willingness to serve. We're all different with different kinds of abilities, and we need to work together. Just as you need your body and its various parts to work in harmony, the church needs all of its parts and people to work together to effectively accomplish the mission. The mission to develop mature faith for Christians and to lead others to that same saving faith. We keep reading. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. Serving, then serve. Teach, then teach. Encourage, encourage. Give, then give. Lead, do it diligently. If it's to show mercy, do it cheerfully. We will never be more like Jesus than when we humbly serve others. Churches that become self-serving create arrogance and pride and hardness of hearts. They become churches filled with spiritually sick people who say, well, I want the church to do this for me, and I want the church to do that, and I want the church to do that. Well, little kids say, I want. And there are a lot of little kids in churches today that are 20, 30, 50, 70, 90, 100 years old, looking to get what they want out of the church. Churches filled with people who are servants, though, who are filled with hearts to just love and encourage people, well, that is something special. And that's what each church needs to strive for. Churches need to be filled with people who say, I will. I will. I will. You know, it's really interesting. Whenever a young kid will step up and help out another child and do something for them and serve them, what do we say? Whoa, well done. And you encourage them. Make sure you tell them, look what they did. And then you tell everybody else, you won't believe what they did. That's amazing. Why do we get excited about that? Because that's not natural. The natural response is, I want. But Jesus calls us to maturity, where we understand is we got to move from I want to I will. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? Can you teach? Are you teaching? If you're able to teach and you're not teaching, I just need to ask you, why not? Well, no one's asked me. I'm asking you. Can you sing? Can you play the piano? What can you do that you haven't told us about? Why don't you offer up your service and just say, look, I'm not saying I'm the best at this, but if you need someone to help with this, I'd be glad to help out. There was a preacher once that was trying to persuade a woman to teach a Sunday school class, and she kept denying it, or declining it, but she was qualified and she had the time, and finally she just said, preacher, I don't want to be tied down. The only way you get out of these jobs is if you die. And the preacher said, you know what's really interesting? We have a master who is willing to be nailed down to some things for us. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? You know, I thought about that. I thought about those of you who have served Crestwood for a long time. And I thought about those of you that have sacrificed hours, days, and years for the benefit of this church. And you've done it with little gratitude, recognition, or thanks. But yet you've still chosen to say, I will, instead of, I want. Now, I was going to give you some examples of some of those servants, but here's the danger in doing that. You always leave someone out. And I didn't want to make anyone leave here today feeling left out. So, Dad and I were talking about that on Friday night, and he said, well, you know, I had a guy like that at the Christian church in Litchfield, and Dad started telling me the story. I said, well, Dad, I can't tell that story, but you can. So, Dad, why don't you come on up here and tell the story of someone who moved from I want to I will.
I can tell you one thing for certain. I'm not here to tell you I will play the piano, okay? Not going to happen, man. Not going to happen. I took piano lessons for 3 years, and the only song I learned to play was Bone, Sweet Bone. And it was painful. It was about 10 or 15 years before I retired at Litchfield that a couple came forward one Sunday and placed their membership, Charlie and Carol Kirby. At the time, I didn't realize it, but those two people were the greatest gift that any church could receive. He had just retired from working at the power plant in Newton, Illinois. They moved to Hillsborough and built a new house. Incredible talent. You look at Charlie in retirement, he was an incredible physical specimen. He had muscles in places I didn't even have places. You know, I mean, he was just a strong guy and vibrant. And now in retirement, he was ready to serve the Lord full time. And he did that. He became a deacon at our church, and I wish I had a copy of the minutes of the board meetings year after year for the next 10 years that Charlie was a part of the church. There's one name that would always come up in every board meeting. It'd be Charlie Kirby. Hey, the chairman of the elders would say, we got a problem, somebody's complaining, there's some shingles have been blown off the roof, and they see them on the ground out in the parking lot. We need somebody to take care of it. Nobody said anything. Charlie said, I'll take care of it. And he did. He was incredibly gifted as a builder. He had helped build his own house, and it was a masterpiece. Sam and I have eaten many meals there with him and visited with him many times, and just beautiful. So talented. Others would say in next meeting, hey, we got problems in the ladies' restroom. It's not flushing properly. There's a leaky sink. Charlie, you take care of it? Yeah, I'll take care of it, man. You come around mowing season, hey, it's time to get the mowers ready. We have 4 acres there at Litchfield, a lot to be mowed. We have 2 riding mowers and a push mower, and it's done through volunteer help. Who's going to get those mowers ready? Charlie's already got them ready, got new blades on them, got them oil change filters, the grease, ready to go. Oh, great job, Charlie. I can't begin to take, I could take the rest of this morning and this afternoon and this week to tell you story after story about, I want to speak up at so many meetings and say, you know, I think, let's see, there are 8 of us. I think 7 of us are unnecessary in this meeting. There's only one person that really shows up to serve and to work. And that wasn't the case. The others did some things, but Charlie set the bar so high. Man, he set it so high. He helped us out on the farm one day. We were laying tile and rented a ditch witch, and we had the guy that farms our grounds helping. Charlie said, well, you need somebody to be able to shoot the grade and make sure that it's dropping as it hits the creek. I can do that. He came, he wouldn't take a dime. Worked out in the sun all day. That's Charlie. He did that for so many people. If there was a need, he's there. But family's moving, count on Charlie. Oh, Charlie will be there. He'll help. Charlie will take care of it. When we had our Christmas Eve service, the biggest service of the year, to where it was standing room only, and sometimes out the door, we had one year over 350, 360 people there. Who's going to organize the communion and the servers and getting it organized and the candlelight? Charlie said, I'll take care of it. Many times Charlie was leaving the next day, take his wife to go to Arizona for a couple months in the winter because of her health problems. But he stayed through Christmas Eve because he wanted to serve. He said, man, this is great. It's the greatest service of the year. Wow. The last year that I was at Litchfield, he got cancer. Make a long story short, he died. It was a long battle that last year, and I had his funeral. And I simply referred to Moses. The first 5 books of the Old Testament were written by Moses. And you come to Joshua, and it simply says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now God says to Joshua, arise and lead these people into the promised land. Moses, the great miracle worker, the great prophet, the great man of God, the stories are endless. His epitaph, written by God, a servant of the Lord. And that's what I use to describe Charlie Kirby in that funeral message. You know, just a few weeks ago, I had lunch with our church administrator at Litchfield. He's also our treasurer. One of the best decisions I ever made in my years at Litchfield was when I hired him and brought him on staff. He's a talented young man, brilliant, smartest guy you'd ever meet in your life, but yet so humble. And so we were talking about the church. I said, hey, how are things going? And he said, Steve, we got some real challenges and some real struggles. He said, we had a furnace go out, we had to replace, we had an air conditioner go out. And he said, you know why? I said, why? He said, you know why? He said, because for years, Charlie Kirby, on his own, maintained those furnaces and changed the filters and checked them out and checked the air conditioning units. He said, we didn't pay a dime. Now we're paying $500 a year, he says, a maintenance contract to keep the rest of them from going out and having to replace them with thousands of dollars it would cost to replace them. He said, that's just one thing. Let me tell you about this summer, he said. on mowing the yard. He said, we got people want to quit mowing the yard. Said, I come in there, there's no gas for the mower. The mower ain't ready, the battery's dead, you know. And he says, he's taking care of the mowers. The blades aren't sharp, they're dull. He said, one guy literally took the empty gas cans when nobody was at the church, placed them in the kitchen of all places, and walked out and said, I'll be back tomorrow when you guys get me some gas. He said, let me tell you, Charlie Kirby every week had those mowers ready. He had them filled with gas, and he had all the cans filled with gas in case they needed any more. And he said, you know something else? He said, Steve, I know this is treasure. Nobody knows this, and Charlie didn't want anyone to know this in his lifetime. He paid for it out of his own pocket. He never once submitted a bill to the church saying, you owe me for all this gas. He said, we never received it. He said, some people, when they do that in church, they just take it off their giving. Not Charlie Kirby. He did that. He did the service, the filters with the furnaces. He did that, painting the lines of the parking lot. All that was donated, the materials as well as his time and his energy. He said, if this church is going to make it, somebody's got to step up and be the next Charlie Kirby. I went to lunch with the chairman of the elders just a couple weeks after that, about a week ago. And he told me, he said, Steve, I'm burned out. He said, in our elders meeting, we're talking about somebody's got to do this ain't taken care of. Somebody said, we got mice in the church. Somebody said, we got ants in the church. Someone says, we got this window that doesn't work. And he said, I just can't do it all. The elders said, we just can't do it all. I said, Charlie Kirby did it all. He goes, I know. You know, this church is here today because there's been some Charlie Kirbys. I don't know who they are. It doesn't matter. Because Charlie Kirby didn't ever. He wouldn't have ever wanted me to get up here and talk like this about him. You talk about humility, and Mark, you nailed it. You nailed it. Without it, throw your service away. Just keep your service. He was a behind-the-scenes guy. He never wanted the credit. He never wanted the glory. He was probably one of the most humble guys I've ever met. But, like Moses, the Charlie Kirbys and the Moseses died. And God says to you and I, now arise and go and lead my people. If this church has a future, it will be because somebody here today says, I'll be that Charlie Kirby. I'll step up, and you can count on me. Will you be that person? I hope you will. Thanks.
I understand it is tough to step up and volunteer because you are afraid you're going to be stuck with the job the rest of your life. But don't you remember, your life on this earth is so temporary, but your time in heaven is forever. I don't know what your giftedness is, but I do know this, that the guy who died for the church is worth living a sacrificial life for today. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? Let's keep reading. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Two final points I want to make out of these verses. The first one is this: you need to fight for your passion. We see these words: sincerity, devotion, honor, zeal, fervor. These words speak about having a passion in your life, and it is worth fighting for because passion comes and goes. Passion is exciting when it's there, and when it's gone, you feel diminished. And so we need to fight for a passion that matters. We read that word fervor. It means enthusiasm and commitment. In the Greek word, it means boiling water. Water that is exceptionally hot. The Christian is not to be lukewarm or cold, but to be passionately serving. But how many people don't take that approach to the church? And I'm not going to say anybody's ever said this to me. I'm just going to give you some examples. It'd be like somebody greeting at the door. And I say, oh, why are you doing that job today? Well, John's been hounding me about greeting at the door, so I wanted to do it. Why are you serving in the nursery? Because Lori, I wanted to shut her up. She just kept asking me again and again, so I got in there to get her off my back. Why are you playing the piano? Because we don't want Mark and Steve playing the piano. That's why. Paul says our attitude should be one of passionately serving the Lord. But passion wavers. There are moments you're not excited about your faith. There are moments that you're so excited about your faith that a hurricane is going to put your fire out. And there's moments your faith is so cold, a blowtorch couldn't warm you up. So what do you do when your passion wavers? When your desire is minimal and you don't feel like it? You remember Jesus, who died for the church. You do the things that Jesus did to reignite that passion. One of the analogies Jesus uses to describe our relationship with the church is a relationship in marriage. And the idea is that the love in the church should look like love in a marriage. Now, Paul Harvey describes 3 stages of love as it pertains to marriage. The first stage is romance. It's where you're infatuated with each other. There's electricity that flows. It takes no work. I mean, there's just no effort put forth whatsoever. But eventually, romance fades away and gives way to tolerance. This phase of a relationship in marriage is where you discover, you know what, that other person's not perfect after all. They have faults, and as a matter of fact, that bugs me quite a bit. That irritates me. And you learn to put up with each other. Now, that doesn't sound very romantic and nice in a marriage, but it's reality. But you hang in there and you get to that third stage, which is mature love. Or as Paul Harvey describes it, love to the 3rd degree. This is where you've shared so much life and intimacy together. You've sacrificed so much time, and this person knows you so completely. They know almost everything about you, and yet they still care for you. It's when you're the most important person in the world to your spouse that you give up your own life for them necessary that you experience what mature love is all about. And while romantic love is exciting, mature love lasts a whole lot longer, and it's a lot more satisfying in the end. But then Paul Harvey pointed out one interesting thing. He says too often when people move from romance to tolerance, they've fallen out of love. And they terminate the relationship and they go searching again, looking to rediscover romance. In their attempt to discover a soulmate who will meet their every need and desire and passion, they delay ultimate fulfillment, recycling that experience again and again. Jesus is the greatest example of someone who had a mature love for the church. He understood he didn't want to die. In the garden before he was arrested, he said, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. If it's possible, let me not die. But not my will. Yours be done. If you want a passion for the church that is lasting beyond emotions, it's got to be based on the word obedience. And it's obedience to God. Jesus gives us 2 ways to fight for our passion. Steve Malone put it this way in one of his sermons. This first one is this: his passion came from what he knew. See, Jesus knew he was going to be betrayed and executed. He knew all that was going to happen. He knew his best friends would abandon him and he would feel the full weight of sin on the cross. But he also knew he was the Son of God and he would rise again. That's why Jesus was able to face it. So when you step up and serve the church, and you willingly take on a role that you didn't want to do, or that you aren't sure that you want to do, or that you want to be committed to for a long time or for any time, you know that you are a child of God and that you are called to serve the church. And you know what you know will help you rise above your emotion. If you want a passion that lasts, you also need to do what Jesus did. His passion came from what he did. It's not just where his mind was at, it's what he willingly did. Jesus sang a hymn with his disciples that night before he went out and he prayed. So he's singing, he's praying. He spends time alone with 3 of his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, and then he prays alone. He demonstrated a passion to be with God at all times. He did the things necessary, like reading the Old Testament. He ministered to people's needs. He taught people's God's truth, and he challenged false teaching. Jesus did all these things whether he felt like them or not. There were times he wanted to be alone and he got swarmed by a crowd, and it says he had compassion on them. He didn't say, you people are driving me crazy, get out of here. He didn't do that. No, he did the things necessary to keep his passion for God's kingdom alive and well. So you might be thinking in your mind, well, Mark, you may tell me you want me to volunteer and step up, but I just don't feel like it. How far will you go for the church that Jesus died for? You fight for that passion with your knowledge and with your actions, and it will be worth it. Verse 11 says, once again, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. The last thing I want you to know is this right here. Remember who you're serving. Remember who you are serving. It's a great reminder for all of us. We sometimes get sideways. We think we're serving ourselves, or we think we're serving people. Well, we can serve ourselves and we can serve people, but no, we are serving the Lord. It's all about Jesus. And when we get this right, Paul says in the rest of the chapter that we'll learn to share. We'll learn to practice hospitality. We'll learn to bless people, celebrate, and cry together. We won't retaliate and try to get even. We'll learn to leave room for God to work and for God's justice to take place. We will do all in our power to live at peace with people. And then Paul ends all that with verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. You remember who it is you serve. And when you get that right, the church will be better than you found it. Do you want to leave the church better than you found it? Then you got to ask yourself the question, how far will I go for the church that Jesus died for? Well, the worship team, as they join me on stage, I want to tell you about a story from Korea. There was a missionary doctor from the United States over there doing volunteer surgeries for people who couldn't afford it. And he came out one night from the tent, and he was just covered in sweat. He had blood on his hands. He was just finished a very delicate operation, taken several hours. And one of the attendants there said, sir, how much would you have been paid in America to do an operation like that? He's like, well, I don't know, $20,000, $25,000. And they said, well, how much will this Korean woman pay you? The doctor hesitated and said, well, she'll offer me nothing but her gratitude. But more than that, I'll get God's smile. When you fight for your passion to serve the church, when you remember who it is that you serve, and when you move away from I want to I will, you're going to leave the church better than you found it. One of the greatest ways to leave the church better than you found it is to make a public commitment, a public profession that Jesus Christ is the Lord of your life. This morning, if you want to leave someone better than you found it, maybe you need to leave yourself better than you found it. And the byproduct is you're going to leave the church better than you found it by setting a wonderful example. If you're ready to put Jesus first, you meet me down front as we stand and as we sing.